When we speak of children who grew up in empty eyes, we are not merely describing a childhood deprived of love, but a soul born in the absence of reflection. For the eye of the parent is the first mirror through which the child glimpses the existence of its own being. Before language, before thought, before even memory, there is the gaze. And when that gaze is hollow, when it looks but does not see, the child learns not the language of love, but the grammar of invisibility. Every infant seeks confirmation in the eyes that behold it. Am I here? That question, unspoken yet cosmic, is answered not by words, but by the radiant echo of the parent seeing. But when the eyes are vacant, distracted, burdened by their own ghosts, the answer returns as silence. The child then learns to survive not by being, but by disappearing. The absence of recognition becomes the first wound of the psyche, the original fracture between the self and the shadow that will one day speak through dreams, compulsions, and the longing for love that cannot be fulfilled. To grow up in empty eyes is to grow up under a spell. The spell says, you exist only when you are useful, when you please, when you perform the illusion of being what the other wants to see. Thus, the child becomes an actor in its own life, wearing faces that reflect not its soul, but the void of others. This adaptation is not falsehood, it is survival. The psyche of such a child becomes a sacred labyrinth. At the center hides the unrecognized self, guarded by monsters of shame and guardians of silence. Many of you sitting here tonight have wandered that labyrinth in your adult life, wondering why love always feels slightly unreal, why closeness brings terror, why you hunger for approval like a starving ghost. These are not flaws of character. They are memories of the soul. You see, the human being is not born whole. We are born in fragments, awaiting reflection to become real. It is through relationship that the psyche discovers itself, but when relationship fails, when the eye that should have been a mirror becomes a void, the psyche must invent mirrors out of fantasy. The child begins to create imaginary worlds, unseen friends, symbolic dreams. It is the unconscious attempting to complete what consciousness could not. In these children, imagination becomes a substitute for intimacy. They learn to speak with shadows, to find comfort in archetypes, to survive by building an inner world so vast that reality itself becomes secondary. And yet, this is not mere pathology. It is the beginning of individuation. The soul, denied its natural nourishment, turns inward, seeking the eternal source that human eyes could not provide. In the mythology of every culture, there is a child abandoned by the gods, left to wander in the wilderness until it finds its destiny. That child is the archetype of the orphan, not simply one without parents, but one without reflection. And yet, in the loneliness of that exile, something miraculous happens. The child encounters the divine within. When no one sees you, you are forced to see yourself, but such seeing is not gentle. It comes through suffering, through nights of despair, through the long silence, where even your own voice feels foreign. That silence is the crucible of transformation. The same wound that made you invisible becomes the doorway through which the self reveals itself. This is why I say that the greatest pain often conceals the greatest potential. The gods hide themselves in our deepest wounds. When a child grows up in empty eyes, they carry an invisible hunger, the hunger to be seen. This hunger follows them into every friendship, every romance, every ambition. They become masters of adaptation, mimicking the desires of others, reading the emotional weather of every room like prophets of survival. But within, they remain haunted by an unspoken question. If I stop performing, will anyone still see me? That question is the shadow of love. It lingers at the edge of every relationship, whispering, don't be too real, or you will vanish again. And so they learn to wear masks, beautiful masks, polite masks, successful masks, but behind them lives a trembling child who has never been touched by recognition. It is easy to call this codependency or insecurity, but that language is too small. What we are witnessing is the archetypal drama of the lost soul seeking reunion with its mirror. The entire history of human suffering can be read as a search for the lost gaze. Religion itself is born from this hunger, the longing to be seen by God, the ultimate other whose eyes never turn away. Every prayer, every confession, every cry to the heavens, do you see me, is the echo of that first unanswered question in the eyes of the parent. Thus, psychology and theology meet in the same wound. The child's need to be seen is the seed of the soul's need for God. But here is the paradox. The gaze that once wounded us is also the key to our awakening. For as long as we search for reflection outside, we remain slaves to emptiness. It is only when we dare to turn our gaze inward into the darkness, into the unremembered pain, that the lost reflection returns. The unconscious, which once seemed like a dungeon, becomes a cathedral. The monsters guarding the labyrinth reveal themselves as angels in disguise, protecting the sacred self from premature exposure. To integrate this knowledge is to reclaim the eyes of the soul, to see yourself not through the projections of others, but through the eternal mirror of your own being. Many people fear this inward journey because it feels like death, and in a sense, it is. The false self that was built to please the empty eyes must die. The persona that once protected you must crumble, for it was never alive, it was only a reflection of the void. But when that mask falls, what remains is the naked truth of your being. That truth is terrifying only because it is vast. It contains both light and darkness, both the abandoned child and the divine parent. You realize at last that you are both the one who was unseen and the one who must now learn to see. The healing of the wound does not come from being seen by others, it comes from becoming the one who sees in dreams. This transformation often appears as a meeting between the child and a mysterious figure. A wise old man, a luminous woman, an animal guide. These are archetypal symbols of the self coming to restore balance. They appear when the psyche is ready to reclaim what was lost. The dream might unfold in a forest, a cave, or a vast empty house. All symbols of the unconscious, where the child finally looks into a mirror and sees not emptiness, but light. That light is not given. It is remembered. The soul has always carried it. Hidden behind the veil of survival, every therapy, every spiritual path, every act of honest self-reflection is an attempt to lift that veil. If you listen carefully, you will hear the voice of the inner child calling from beneath your thoughts. It does not speak in words, but in sensations, in the sudden wave of sadness, when someone looks away, in the inexplicable fear of rejection, in the exhaustion of pretending to be fine. These are not weaknesses. They are messages from the soul. To ignore them is to repeat the pattern of the empty gaze. To listen is to begin the great work, the opus magnum of individuation. In alchemy, the first stage of transformation is nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness. For the child of empty eyes, this stage is to return to the original void, to feel again the pain of not being seen. But this time, you enter consciously. This time, you are the one who watches, and that makes all the difference. For when consciousness descends into darkness, the unconscious begins to transform. What happens when the unseen child is finally seen? Not by the world, but by the self. There is a quiet explosion. The heart, once frozen, begins to thaw. Tears flow not as grief, but as recognition. The psyche reorganizes itself around a new center. No longer the hunger for reflection, but the presence of being. You begin to see that the emptiness of those eyes was never truly about you. It was their own blindness, their own exile from their soul. Compassion arises, not the sentimental kind, but the deep knowing that every wound carries its own chain of inheritance. The eyes that could not see you were once unseen themselves, and thus the pattern perpetuates until someone dares to look differently. That someone is you. When you turn towards the inner child and meet its gaze with love, you become the mirror that was missing. This is not imagination, it is the act of psychological redemption. You are rescuing your own reflection from the void, and as you do, you begin to see others differently. No longer do you seek approval, you offer presence. No longer do you crave being seen, you become the one who sees. The emptiness that once haunted you becomes the space through which light can move. You realize that your very capacity for empathy, for understanding the pain of others, was born from your own invisible childhood. The child of empty eyes becomes the healer with luminous vision. The next movement of this journey begins when the child of empty eyes meets love. It is here that the old wound, long buried in the unconscious, begins to stir again. For love, true love, is not gentle at first. It awakens what we have hidden. When someone looks at you with genuine attention, when their eyes begin to see into the depth where no one has looked before, the soul trembles. It is as if an ancient door rusted shut by years of neglect, suddenly opens and light floods the forgotten chambers, but along with the light comes shadow, all the unwept tears, all the suppressed cries, all the frozen fears awaken. The very presence you longed for begins to terrify you, because the soul remembers what it once meant to be seen and abandoned. Thus, intimacy becomes both medicine and poison, blessing and curse. To the unconscious, love is repetition. It does not distinguish between the present and the past. When someone looks at you now, the psyche hears the echo of the old gaze, that hollow, indifferent stare of childhood, and prepares for the same pain. The heart contracts before it can open. You push away what you desire most, not because you do not want it, but because you fear that once again it will vanish. This is the paradox of trauma. It teaches the child to guard against the very thing it needs to live. So the adult learns to control love, to measure closeness, to stay half present. And yet, beneath the caution, there is still the ancient hunger to be seen without disappearing. When we analyze this psychologically, we must remember that every pattern of avoidance is an archetypal drama. The lover who cannot stay, the friend who withdraws when things grow real, the person who hides behind achievements, each is acting out the myth of Narcissus and Echo. Narcissus cannot love because he seeks himself in others. Echo cannot be heard because she has no voice of her own. Both are trapped in the mirror of emptiness. The child of empty eyes becomes both Narcissus and Echo, forever calling and forever looking, trapped between the hunger to be seen and the terror of being known. Yet there is redemption in this myth, for Narcissus, upon gazing into the water, finally sees not himself but the illusion of himself. And in that moment of despair, when he realizes that the reflection cannot love him back, he dies, not in the literal sense, but in the psychological sense. The persona dies, the false mirror dissolves, and from the place where he fell, a new flower grows, the symbol of rebirth, the psyche's resurrection from self-illusion, the child of empty eyes, too, must one day die to the reflection that was never real. They must surrender the image they built to survive the perfect one, the pleasing one, the useful one, and let it sink into the waters of the unconscious. Only then can they be reborn as the self. But this dying is not easy. The unconscious resists transformation. It clings to its old gods, its familiar suffering, because even pain offers identity. To let go of the false reflection is to face the void again, the same void that once whispered, "You are nothing," and yet it is within that nothingness that everything begins. The void is not absence, it is potential, it is the womb of the soul. The mystics knew this long before psychology, that only through emptiness can form be renewed. When the child who grew up unseen returns willingly to the emptiness, something miraculous occurs. They no longer enter as a victim, but as a witness. They see the darkness not as punishment, but as the primordial field of creation. What once felt like exile now becomes initiation. In my own work with patients, I have seen this countless times. The moment when a person, after years of running from their inner emptiness, suddenly turns around and looks directly into it, there is a silence. In that moment, unlike any other, a silence thick with the presence of the self. Often tears come, but not from sadness. They come from recognition. The soul says, "Ah, there you are." The child, once invisible, finally meets the gaze of the divine within. It is not a psychological trick or positive affirmation. It is a sacred event. For the first time, consciousness and unconsciousness meet face to face. This is the union the alchemists called conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. This is why dreams are so vital in the healing of those who grew up unseen, the unconscious, unable to speak in words, speaks in symbols. A dream might show a locked house whose windows are covered with dust, or a child calling from a basement, or a bird trapped behind glass. These are not random images, they are messages from the forgotten parts of the psyche. The dust is neglect, the basement is repression. The glass is the transparent barrier between visibility and isolation. To work with such dreams is to enter conversation with the soul. The analyst becomes a midwife, helping the patient give birth to what has been trapped in the unconscious womb. And as the dream images unfold, the child begins to speak at last. You may notice that those who grew up unseen often carry a peculiar sensitivity, an ability to feel what others cannot name. This is both a gift and a burden, because they learn to survive by attuning to the slightest change in the emotional weather. They develop an almost mystical empathy. They sense the pain behind words, the tension behind smiles, but this gift, if unconscious, becomes self-destructive. They absorb others' emotions to fill the void of their own. The task, therefore, is not to extinguish sensitivity, but to sanctify it, to transform empathy from survival into vision. When you stop using empathy to win love, it becomes the instrument through which the soul perceives truth. Then the eyes that were once empty become luminous. The transformation of emptiness into light is one of the deepest mysteries of the psyche. It mirrors the alchemical process by which base matter is turned into gold. The base matter is the wound itself, the childhood marked by neglect and invisibility. Gold is consciousness, the light of understanding that arises when we no longer flee from our pain. Every tear becomes a drop of mercury. Every memory, once faced, becomes a spark in the crucible of the heart. The alchemists said, in sterculinio invenitur aurum, in the dung heap, gold is found. Psychology confirms the same. In the refuse of the soul, in the places we were taught to despise, lies the treasure of wholeness. If we extend this reflection into the collective, we begin to see that the empty eyes of parents are not personal failures alone. They are symptoms of a deeper cultural blindness. A society that worships productivity over presence image over essence, inevitably breeds generations of unseen children. We have built institutions that mirror the same emptiness, schools that reward performance over authenticity, families that confuse obedience with love, religions that preach perfection but neglect compassion. The empty eyes are everywhere, and so the work of healing is not only individual, it is archetypal. To reclaim the capacity to see is to redeem a fragment of the world's lost soul. When you begin to see yourself truly, you begin to see others. The boundary between self and world dissolves. You realize that the emptiness in your parents' eyes was the same emptiness that haunted humanity, a blindness born from fear, from trauma, passed down through generations. To see this is not to excuse it, but to understand it, and through understanding comes liberation. You no longer carry their blindness as your own. You begin to look through your own eyes, and they are not empty. They are ancient, radiant, alive. The gaze of consciousness becomes an act of creation. When you look at another being and truly see them, you restore a fragment of the divine order. You become the mirror that heals. There comes a point in the journey when the child who once trembled before every gaze must learn the sacred art of seeing again, but now from within. At first, this seems impossible. How can one who has spent a lifetime searching for reflection now become the source of it? Yet this is the essence of individuation, to retrieve from the world what we once sought outside and to awaken it within the soul itself. Love, then, is no longer a bargain for visibility. It becomes a state of being. It is the eye through which the universe looks upon itself. When the inner eye opens, one begins to perceive that the emptiness was never void of meaning. It was the womb of the unseen God, gestating awareness in secret. Those who grew up in empty eyes were initiated, though they did not know it, into the mystery of divine absence. For to be unseen by others forces one to seek the gaze of the eternal, and that gaze does not come from above. It arises from within, in the stillness of solitude, in the aching silence after love fails, in the midnight hours when all masks have fallen. You begin to sense a presence, a warmth behind the darkness, a witness that has never turned away. That is the self, that is the God image within, awakening. But before this light stabilizes, the psyche must endure one last ordeal, the temptation of projection. Even as you awaken, you will be drawn to cast this newfound divinity upon others, to see in a lover, a teacher, or a spiritual figure, the reflection of your inner self. This too is part of the process. The unconscious uses projection as a bridge between inner and outer worlds. We fall in love, we idealize, we worship, because we are learning through others to recognize the face of the divine. But every projection must eventually be withdrawn, lest it imprison the soul once more in dependency. The lover is not the God, they are the mirror. The pain of disillusionment, when the mirror shatters, is the birth of true vision. You may notice that the more you awaken, the more solitude becomes your companion. This is not isolation in the neurotic sense, but solitude in the mystical sense, the state in which the soul communes with its own depths. In this silence, you begin to hear the language of symbols again, in the same language you spoke as a child, in dreams and play. The imagination, long exiled to fantasy, becomes sacred once more. You realize that imagination was never a means of escape. It was the voice of the unconscious speaking in metaphor. The empty eyes of childhood closed the outer world, but opened the inner. You now learn to walk in both. In this space, the archetype of the wounded mirror reveals its final teaching. The mirror, once empty, has become transparent. Light passes through it. You no longer seek to be reflected, nor to reflect others. You simply see, and in seeing, you create. Every genuine act of attention becomes alchemical. It transforms what it beholds. When you look upon your own pain with compassion, you redeem it. When you see another's suffering without judgment, you liberate them from invisibility. To see is to bless. The eyes that once pleaded, "See me," now whisper, "I see." That is the moment the wound becomes wisdom. Psychologically, this is the integration of the shadow. The parts of the psyche that were rejected, the rage, the jealousy, the despair are no longer enemies. They are the exiled children returning home. When you welcome them, you discover that they were never evil. They were simply abandoned. The shadow is not darkness. It is unlived life. Each emotion you once repressed now offers its gift. Anger becomes power. Grief becomes depth. Fear becomes intuition. The psyche, once fragmented, begins to sing again. This is what I call psychic wholeness, not perfection, but harmony among opposites. You become a vessel through which the unconscious and consciousness flow together in creative tension. In mythic terms, this is the descent into the underworld and the return. Orpheus, who lost Eurydice because he looked back, represents the soul that cannot yet bear the full light of consciousness. Haggis is behind, and the image vanishes. But when the soul learns to see without clinging to behold, without possession, Eurydice returns in another form. As inner presence, the beloved is no longer external. She lives within as anima, the feminine soul image that mediates between human and divine. Likewise, for the woman, the inner masculine, the animus awakens as the guiding principle of wisdom and purpose. The union of these inner figures marks the completion of the psychic alchemy. It is the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of inner opposites. At this stage, you no longer ask, "Who sees me?" but rather, "Through whose eyes do I see?" You recognize that perception itself is divine participation. The world around you begins to shimmer with the subtle awareness that it is alive. Trees seem to breathe. stones, to listen, the ear, to carry messages. This is not madness. It is the restoration of symbolic perception. The child, once blinded by the emptiness of human eyes, now perceives the presence of spirit in all things. The eye of the soul has opened, and the universe is its reflection. Yet there is still humility in this awakening. The more one sees, the more one feels the sacred weight of being human. You understand that no one escapes the wound. Even those who seemed whole carry their own invisible fractures. You begin to forgive not from superiority, but from kinship. You see your parents differently, not as gods who failed, but as children who were also unseen. The lineage of emptiness stretches back through generations. When you choose to see with love, you end the chain. You become the ancestor who restores sight to the family soul. This act of seeing transforms the simplest gestures. When you listen to another without interruption, you give them what no therapy or philosophy can offer: the sense of existing in another's consciousness. That is sacred work. It is the reversal of the original wound. You become the eyes that heal, the gaze that blesses. Every look, every word, every moment of attention becomes a silent prayer. I see you, and therefore you are. The theologians might call this agape. I call it the consciousness of the self made manifest in human form. In dreams that follow such awakening, the imagery changes. No longer is there a child crying in the basement. Instead, you may dream of a garden returning to life, of a fountain bubbling again, of windows being opened to sunlight. The psyche, once barren, become fertile. Creativity returns not as performance, but as natural expression. You paint, write, sing, or simply live in a way that mirrors the inner abundance. The emptiness has become space, the sacred emptiness that allows life to unfold. From a metaphysical perspective, we could say that this is the moment when the soul completes its descent into matter and begins its ascent towards spirit. But ascent here does not mean escape from the world. It means seeing the divine in the world. You walk through the same streets, meet the same people, but everything feels subtly illuminated. What you once perceived as emptiness now glows with significance. Even sorrow carries meaning, for it reminds you of the eternal rhythm, the contraction and expansion of the divine breath within human experience. To live with open eyes after growing up in empty ones is to participate consciously in creation. The gaze becomes prayer. Attention becomes offering. You begin to see that every encounter, every silence, every heartbreak was part of the soul's design to teach you the language of seeing. You realize that you were never truly invisible. The divine eye was always upon you, even in the moments when human eyes were blind. And now, through your own awakened vision, that divine gaze enters the world again. There's a moment, subtle and profound, when the soul that has healed its vision turns outward again, not from need, but from fullness. The one who once wandered through the desert of invisibility begins to see the landscape of humanity with new eyes. Where once there was only threat, now there is tenderness. Where once every gaze was a test, now each encounter becomes a revelation. The eyes that once sought reflection now offer it. The wound has become a lens through which the world itself begins to awaken. This is the final alchemy of the child who grew up in empty eyes, to realize that they were chosen, not cursed, to bear the weight of sight. For only those who have known the abyss of absence can recognize the holiness of presence. Only those who have walked through the void can understand what it means for light to exist at all. You see, suffering, when endured consciously, refine perception. It strips away illusion. It teaches the soul to discern between the shadow and the substance, between appearance and essence. What remains is vision clear, compassionate, and fierce. At this point, you begin to perceive that your personal history was never merely personal. The story of the unseen child is the story of humanity itself. We are a species suffering from blindness, technological eyes that see everything but the soul, social eyes that admire performance but not being, political eyes that measure worth but not wonder. In such a world, the healed seer becomes a revolutionary presence. To truly see another human being in their wholeness is an act of defiance against a culture of invisibility. It is to restore the sacred in the midst of the mechanical. Imagine for a moment that your gaze carries light. When you walk through the world, every person you meet receives a fragment of that light, an unspoken affirmation that they exist. You are not fixing them, not analyzing, not rescuing. You are simply seeing, and yet in that seeing, they remember something ancient within themselves, the same divine witness that once awoke in you. Thus, consciousness spreads not through preaching, but through presence. This is how collective healing begins, one gaze at a time. You may not realize it, but this is also the archetype of the healer, the one who transforms poison into medicine. In mythology, the wounded healer is not the one who cures from perfection, but the one whose very wound becomes the source of compassion. Jung, the immortal centaur, could not heal his own wound, yet through his suffering he became a teacher of healing. Likewise, those who grew up unseen possess an instinctive capacity to recognize the unseen in others. The pain that once isolated them becomes the bridge that connects them to the collective heart. This is the paradox of redemption. What was once your greatest absence becomes the world's illumination. The deeper the healing, the more you sense that you will never separate from the collective unconscious. The personal wound opens into the archetypal ocean. When you close your eyes now, you can feel the pulse of humanity moving through you, the grief of forgotten generations, the yearning of countless children who never heard, "I see you." And as you breathe into that grief, something extraordinary happens. The individual psyche merges with the cosmic, your personal story dissolves into the universal myth of the soul returning to itself. You are no longer merely you. You are consciousness awakening to its own reflection through your eyes. But let me be clear, this is not grandiosity. It is humility of the highest order, for to see the divine in all things is to feel the immense tenderness of existence. Every being becomes sacred, every moment holy. You no longer divide life into good and bad, success and failure, worthy and unworthy. You see the pattern, the great mandala of opposites in eternal dance. Even pain now has meaning, for it reveals depth. Even shadow now has purpose, for it defines the light. To live in this awareness is to walk in two worlds at once, the human and the divine, the visible and the unseen. The ancient mystics called this state the marriage of heaven and earth. Psychologically, it is the completion of individuation, the integration of all opposites within the self. The ego no longer struggles for control. It becomes transparent, an instrument of a greater will. The will of the self is not ambition. It is the quiet, steady unfolding of what must be. You live no longer from fear of being unseen, but from the joy of seeing. Your actions, words, and silences all radiate from that same inner source. Life ceases to be something that happens to you. It becomes something that happens through you. When you live this way, the world responds differently. Synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that defy logic, begin to appear more often. They are the language of the self in dialogue with the outer world. The invisible eye within you recognizes itself in the events around you. It is as if reality itself begins to mirror your inner transformation. A chance meeting, a line in a book, a sudden intuition, each becomes a message from the deeper order of being. This is not superstition. It is symbolic living. The unconscious no longer hides in dreams alone. It speaks through life itself. And yet, even here, the journey does not end. The process of seeing, like breathing, continues until the last moment of existence. There will still be days when the old fear returns, when the eyes of the world seem cold again. But now you understand that even this is part of the rhythm, the ebb and flow of light and shadow. You no longer panic when darkness comes. You welcome it as nightfall before dawn. For you know that the light within cannot be lost, it only changes form. What then becomes of the child who once lived unseen? They do not vanish, they mature. The child remains within as a guardian of authenticity, reminding you always of what is real. They are the heart of your compassion, the keeper of your innocence, the silent witness that makes your eyes soft when you look upon another's pain. The task is not to transcend the child, but to integrate them, to walk hand in hand with the one who once hid behind masks. In doing so, you fulfill the deepest wish of that child, not to be perfect, but to be whole. In this wholeness, your gaze becomes something different from the human eyes you once feared. It becomes what the mystics called the seeing of the heart. These are not the eyes that look outward for approval, nor the eyes that judge, but the eyes that bless. When you see from the heart, you no longer perceive separation. You feel the unity that underlies all forms, the invisible thread that weaves together joy and sorrow, self and other, life and death. To see in this way is to live as part of eternity, even while walking through time. And perhaps this is the hidden meaning of those empty eyes of childhood. They were not a mistake. They were a call. Through them, life whispered, "Will you learn to see?" And through the long years of blindness, through pain and searching, through every heartbreak that forced you to look deeper, you answered, "You have learned that sight is not granted by others, it is born from within. The eyes of flesh can fail, but the eyes of the soul never close. So when you walk now among the living, remember, every being you meet carries the same secret hunger to be seen, not with the gaze of judgment, but with the gaze of presence. You cannot erase their pain, but you can meet it. You can offer them what was once denied to you, the simple, sacred affirmation of being. To look upon another with understanding is to say, without words, you are real, you belong, you are not invisible. This is the final gift of those who grew up in empty eyes. They become the eyes of the world, reborn. Through them, consciousness sees itself again. Through them, the divine remembers its reflection in human form. And as they walk silently through the great field of existence, everything they touch by sight, by word, by presence comes alive. For to be seen is to be. And so the circle closes. The child who once vanished in the absence of reflection has become the reflection itself, the living mirror of God.